Well, my body lies over the ocean. My body lies over the sea. Ooh, my body lies over the ocean. Oh, bring back my body to me. Bring back, oh, bring back
And
my
welcome
body.
to the Scott Arizala Show presented by camphacker.org. My name's Travis Allison. Hey Scott, how's it going today?
Excellent. Thanks again for hosting, Travis. Today we are going to start our staff training series. We're going to try and do a bunch of different topics around staff training. And for the very first one, I thought I wanted to really talk about one of the major issues with staff training, which is kind of time. I've never once met a camp director who says that they have plenty of time for staff training. And I know camps that do like 3 full weeks of training, as well as I know camps that have, the 24-hour before kids come for training. So, I think this idea of what staff training is really all about, and time, and how does it all play together, and really this concept of staff training around more with less, right? Doing more with less, that I think we've all had to sort of struggle with and wrap our heads around. So that's kind of where I wanted to start our series on staff training. And in thinking about developing this particular episode and the content for this episode, I was thinking about my first 2 years at the camp that I'm currently the director of, Dragonfly Forest. This last summer was my 5th summer. It's only our 6th year in existence. So, I've been there basically from the beginning, and I've been blessed with this opportunity to build a camp really from scratch, from the ground up. And my very first summer, I had, I think, 2.5 days or something like that for staff training. And, here I am like a professional staff trainer, having worked at, a bunch of different camps, having trained at literally, hundreds if not thousands of camps. And so I now had this opportunity to develop my very own staff training, 2.5 days of anything that I wanted, right? And so I tell you right now, I packed it in. I stuffed as much stuff as I could in those 2.5 days. I mean, I had them going from the first thing, 7 o'clock in the morning, so like activities we were doing before breakfast that was debriefed at breakfast, all the way through like cabin chat at 11 o'clock at night with very specific planted questions in cabin chat. I mean, I had every moment of every day mapped out. And it didn't go so well. Not only training didn't go so well, my first summer the staff was okay, not great. There was a lot of issues as far as like staff didn't know what to do, whatever. And then, I had to step back, and I would tell you that was quite a blow to my ego, because I was like, what, shouldn't I have the best staff ever? I mean, I'm a professional staff trainer. Like, shouldn't my staff be amazing? Didn't I do this amazing job training? And I realized that, no. I mean, the answer was significantly no. I did not do a good job training. Sure, I might have, broke my back, but, sort of presenting for 20 hours each day during staff training, but that doesn't mean it was any good. And so what I did is I took a really big step back, and I said, all right, what are like the 10 things that I think are the most important things to do during training? And I will tell you that process killed me. Because here I am crossing things off the list that all of us would say are extremely important. This camp, Dragonfly Forest, is a medical camp. It's for kids with serious illnesses and disorders. And I was crossing things off of the list like, well, they don't really need to know too much about hemophilia, because we've got doctors and nurses there, so we can scratch off the whole 3 hours that we were going to do about hemophilia. That's kind of significant when you're running a camp for kids with hemophilia, right? So I basically went back and I said, how can we do more with less? and I developed a couple of themes, a couple of patterns, like how I was going to kind of come back to some ideas. And I really took just like the top 10 things that I thought were going to be the most important, and those are the things that I built into my training. That was the difference between my first 2 years at Dragonfly, and since I've gone even farther. I've tried to build in things like downtime, simple review time, small group activities where we get together and we talk about the last couple of hours of training. I mean, things that on the face of it look like I'm wasting time. But as far as teaching is concerned, I think is a better strategy and a better way to go. So that's kind of what I mean by more with less.
Well, when you told me last year that you had 2.5 days of training, I was floored, because we're always trying to cram stuff in when we had 8 days plus an extra weekend to fit all of our training time in.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge.
So how were you able to make that decision?
Oh, with many sleepless night. I mean, what it came down to is, there's some essential skills that counselors need to have, and there are things that I know they're going to learn just from being at camp. And so I really had to go through and really think clearly about, well, what are these essential skills? What do we need to spend time on? What do I know that they're going to get just through the process of doing camp? And what can I do better at as far as teaching more implicitly instead of explicitly? And I'll give you a good example of that. One of the things that I think is really important as far as like a skill that counselors need to have is this idea of being patient. I think we did an episode on it with the Camp Hacker and Scott Arizala show. It's something I talk about in all of my trainings that I do at other camps. Yet when I was looking at the sort of priority of things, the 1 or 1.5 hours of patience training that I would do just like didn't make the cut. But how could, in like my heart of hearts, how could I really cut that? In fact, I think it's so important that it often has become like a theme of training. So what I did is I took this idea of patience and I tried to create a pattern around what we were doing that oftentimes came back to that. So I'll give you some examples. During role plays, for like some behavior management stuff, or some homesickness pieces, or some difficult sort of management kind of stuff with the unit leaders as far as managing their staff. During role plays, one of the sort of themes during the different sort of scenarios that they would get up in role play would be a situation where a counselor with kids or a unit leader with staff needed to really exercise their sort of patience. During small group discussions, one of the questions that we would bring back up about, the topic of praise, or the topic of clear communication, or the topic of, working with kids with different needs, one of the questions, sort of the debrief questions in those small group activities, would center around the idea of patience. So different ways to get at, and this is what I meant by like implicit learning. Like my staff, after 2.5 or 3 days of training, I'm very confident would have some pretty significant tools and ideas around how to maintain sort of a really high level of patience. And not once did we sit down and say, okay, for the next hour, we're going to talk about being really patient counselors. So that's kind of what I mean by sort of implicit teaching and doing more with less.
Are there other themes that you've wrapped up into the training?
Oh, most definitely. Praise actually is one of them that I've done a lot. Communication is one that I've done a lot. Like, what are we communicating? Like, how are we communicating this? Goal setting is one that I've done a lot. Overcoming challenges is something that I really like to do, specifically with the population that we work with at Dragonfly, to be able to come back to that sort of central idea of how do we help engage kids around overcoming challenges. Working with kids and guiding and developing positive behavior versus sort of just dealing with negative or challenging behavior is a big idea that we've come back to a lot. So all those kinds of things, right? Anything that I just spoke about you could imagine being an hour long, a 2 hour long training session, right? So sometimes we've pulled those things out and it's become sort of the overall or sort of, a big theme or overarching sort of category of training.
What are the best ways, Scott, for in that short period of time for staff to have good goals and objectives to get it all in them?
Long time ago, 10 years ago now or something, I read a bunch of work that a guy named Dr. Randall Grayson did, and he's a camp director, I want to say out west in the U.S., maybe Camp Augusta. I'm probably butchering that. But his name is Dr. Randall Grayson. He's the stuff that he has put out around staff training is just amazing. I love what he does. He talked about 3 sort of essential components in thinking about goals and objectives of your staff training. And he may have used different words, but he talked about the sort of 3 central ideas were knowledge, behavior, and belief or attitude. And he said all of your training sessions should have an outcome based in one of these in one of these areas, right? So every single training session, you should be able to point to what is a staff person learning, like what's the knowledge that they're learning about this topic or subject. What's the behavior change? Like what are they actually learning how to do that's different or that's maybe validating as far as what they've done in the past, or what's the new technique around how they're going to handle this or that or whatever. But what's the behavior change that you're going to affect through this particular training session? And the last piece, and I think this can be one of the more challenging pieces, is how does this fit into the sort of buy-in, the sort of attitude that what we're doing is the sort of right thing to be doing. The staff need to believe that what you're telling them in this training session is not only going to be helpful to their job, but sort of fits into the goal of what we're trying to do with kids. That's where like a theme or a pattern like overcoming challenges for my staff and at my camp is really powerful. I mean, staff totally understand that when you've got 90 kids with autism, sure, they've definitely got some challenges in their lives, right? And so that's not a stretch for them to sort of buy into this idea that, we need to be sort of helping our kids sort of gather up some strategies and techniques around overcoming challenges. So again, Dr. Grayson talked about how do you, when you're building these goals and objectives for particular sessions or overall your big themes or ideas, can you speak to those 3 pieces? I think that's been one of the guiding factors in every training session that I've ever developed, whether that's for another camp or my own.
So how much of that changes from year to year? And are you doing sort of it with the same staff? And really, do you have a lot of changeover with the unique style of your camp? I just wonder how much of the staff changes or you can just build.
Well, with my camp, it's really interesting because over the last 5 years, I've had to deal with just about every variation that you can imagine, right? From brand new, everybody was a brand new staff member, to last year where we had almost 90% of a return rate, which some would argue is too high. I definitely work with some of those kind of camps that are out there that have closer to 100% return rate. There are a lot of folks that would argue, more like 70% return is about the ideal because you get enough fresh blood in there. And I've had to deal with sort of all these different variations. It absolutely, in my opinion, changes how you do training, right? When you have a brand new staff, a brand new camp, well, there's a lot of like, this is the culture of camp that we have to sort of set and teach. And sometimes that can be implicit in just how we run the schedule, how we run the day, all that kind of stuff. Some of it has to be more explicit when you're dealing with a totally brand new staff versus, 90 to 100% return rate. Well, they get it, you don't have to do as much sort of explicit teaching around, for example, the culture of camp. So there's all sort of different strategies. Over the last 2 years that my camp has had a much higher return rate, what we've done is we've tried to take a look at exactly what sort of, again, those big ideas, those big themes are. You know, last year we had close to a 90% return rate. This year we're going to have close to a 90% return rate. It's allowed me to do things, I'll say it differently, it's allowed me to go back to that list, right? The one that I chopped up and I had said, okay, these are the top 10 things. Well, I know since I have, you know, a second year of 90 plus return, you know, 90+% return rate, I know that they're pretty good at a couple of these things. I can knock them off the list and bump up some of the other things that we weren't paying as much attention to in the last couple of years. Of course, when you have a really high return rate, you can do things like, overall, in general, where did we kind of fall short? Where did we struggle last year that I really want to put some time and energy into sort of developing this year? You know, those kinds of ideas I think are really important when, again, you're trying to be more effective at fewer things during training.
3 Adventures International Camp staff.
3 things you should know about 3 Adventures. 1. Our owners are all former camp directors. 2. We're a high-quality company that's easy on your budget. 3. Background checks. Our international camp staff come from all over the world, and every one of them has had a background check. No exceptions, no excuses. 3adventures.com, the site to get great camps connected with great staff.
So do you do much pre-training before they arrive? For example, do you make them watch your own expert online training videos?
You know, I got so much flack from my staff the first year I had to do expert online training because, of course, you know, I had them watch some of my videos and they were like, you know, it's incredibly, you know, narcissistic of you to like make us watch your videos, right? And I'm like, well, you know, it's like, well, they're the best ones. But yeah, you know, for those of you who don't know, expert online training is a unbelievable resource and tool out there, and I am a part of it. I have done videos, but I think even if I hadn't, I would highly suggest it. It's basically video training modules that your staff can do well before camp. Having said that, you know, I think there are other things that we could have them do. I've done things like I've gotten some of the program staff at my camp sort of together on conference calls to talk a little bit about some of the program ideas. I certainly have tried to, in years past, I've played around with things like trying to get some material out into their hands, like the policies and procedures, for example. If you can get those things out into their hand before they even get to camp, that moment that you have to have in training where you're kind of running through all the different policies and procedures, you can minimize that because they've all had it before you even got there. But you know, there's not quite a tool like out there like expert online training, in my opinion, because you know, when you're just sending them stuff, you're not exactly sure how much they're actually sort of absorbing, and that I think is that's one of the bigger pieces to expert online training, is that not only is there these videos that are you know, tend to be easier to sort of consume than, you know, 10 pages out of your staff manual, but there's the proficiency quizzes, which I think are pretty important. If you have the luxury of having maybe a day camp or a camp that you're pulling from a particular community, and you have the opportunity to get your staff together, even if it's sort of informal and it's not necessarily mandatory, that's probably the best thing you can do as far as any work that you're doing beforehand. Getting them together, having them talk through particular issues, having them do some program brainstorms, really anything that gets them in the sort of mode of camp is going to facilitate better learning and better training at the end of the day. You know, not everybody gets an opportunity to do this, but one of the camps that I run for Camp Kesem, which is a student-run organization, is the camp at UC Berkeley has actually developed a class that a student-run class that, it's every Wednesday night for an hour or two during the sort of second semester. And it's great because, all their counselors, it's mandatory. They show up. I mean, it's a class. They get credit for it. So they show up, once a week, and they now have this opportunity for an hour, for 15 Wednesdays in a row. They can talk about, whatever. I mean, that's 15 hours. That's a whole day of training that they wouldn't get anywhere else, and that keeps everybody sort of in that camp spirit throughout the school year. Now, of course, not everybody has the opportunity to do something like that, but it's thinking outside the box as far as creative ideas like that I think are important.
Well, and there's no reason that with all the available tools, for example, what we're doing here today, that you couldn't host one night a month for an hour and a half of training, and everybody watches it online, and those that don't make it then can watch the video later. And there's lots of free online tools that you could use to quiz them on what happened in that hour and a half. So that what they have heard that they're taking in, and you have a record that everybody's at least watched and paid attention to what's going on. And that way that at least you're getting it into them.
Sure. And I think in general, right, as camp directors, we need to get away from this. We need to get away from our sick compulsion and obsession that all of us share as camp people, that it needs to somehow be really complete, and we need to sort of sew it up real tightly. And all of us get kind of nuts when we're when somebody, emails us and says, I have this graduation thing that I need to do. Can I miss one day of training? And all of us are ooh, nobody likes that. One, I think folks like the ACA kind of sort of pound that into our heads. I mean, so much so that we have to fill out forms on who's done what training, some of which I totally get and I understand, and I'm not, I don't want to disregard some of those standards and what from the ACA, but I think we push that so far to feel like if I'm going to do a training online, but I can't get 100% participation, is it really worth my time? And my answer to that is absolutely 100% yes, of course it is. If you can change the perspective or help make just one of your counselors a more effective counselor, it's worth your time. Right? Of course you're going to have to double up work. Of course you're going to have to do it more than once. Of course you're going to have to restate things at training and all that kind of stuff. But I think if we can all move away from this idea that this feeling, it's not even an idea. I think most people would agree with me, but the emotional part is what we struggle with. This feeling not everyone's going to get it, or not everyone's going to be there, and somehow that's a problem. I think we need to be more flexible with that, and emotionally we need to get over ourselves and say, what? It's fine. Maybe I should get on vocal and do, if 10 of my 15 unit leaders can come and the other 5 watch it at their leisure, or better yet, let's be realistic and say 10 are going to show up, 2 are going to watch it later, and 3 are never even going to open the email from me that says to watch it. Okay, I can deal with that. That's 10 people that, might have some, may have paid attention to what I was saying when I was online. Maybe not. We'll see.
Scott, I wonder, before we get into the wrap-up points for this discussion, if you can tell us what you think are those 10 things. What are the 10 things that are most important to get into your staff's brain during training?
That's a hard question to ask off the top of my head. I mean, where I would start is I would look at and this is not a really sort of emotionally, great place to start, but I would actually start with what's mandatory first, whether that's, ACA standards, sort of, local, state, national laws, health, department or health kind of code stuff. I would look at what's mandatory. Child abuse training, those kinds of things, because the real reality is that you do have things on your list that, because of state, local law, standards, accreditation kind of stuff, or restrictions, you have to do. Okay, so you take those things and you sort of put them in this sort of box on the side and say, well, we've got to do those things. Now, what's the list after that? In my opinion, I take a look at what's going to be most effective as a single counselor working with 1, 2, 3, or a group of kids. What do I want them to sort of be armed with? So I will start by thinking about things like, okay, what are some of the most essential skills for that person? And it's going to be things like good communication skills. Well, what does that mean? Effective ways to praise, effective ways to be clear at giving directions, effective ways to be dealing with challenging behavior. So you can see how this is sort of starts to branch out. Okay, behavior management stuff, really dealing with negative behavior. What are some of the really essential skills there? Having hard conversations, dealing with logical consequences versus punishment, right? Really two very different things. What do some of those conversations sound like, and how do we lead kids toward making better choices? There's the whole other side of behavior management that I always talk about. I think this is absolutely 100% huge. Dealing with promoting and guiding positive behavior. Take a look at what your goals, what are your values, what are the objectives of your organization. How do you implement those things on the ground? YMCA is a good example, right? What are the core values of YMCA? Respect, responsibility, caring, and honesty. How do we actually implement those things as far as behavior on the ground? What are we really talking about? We're talking about positive, positive behavior development, right? But wrapped around these sort of core ideas, whether you're, a YMCA or a Salvation Army camp or Girl Scouts or whatever. You can keep going down the list, right? I mean, I think dealing with ideas like homesickness, for example, are huge. Dealing with skill sets that counselors need to have. Again, thinking about this counselor with this group of kids around them. What do I want them to be really good at? Whether that's homesickness or being creative or being enthusiastic. Maybe I'm talking about this other counselor over here who's a program leader. Well, there's some different skills there. I really want them to be able to manage larger groups. So what are the skills that go into that? So that wasn't as clean as here's the top 10 things, but I had to have just mentioned 10 or more things. And I think that's kind of how you have to develop what goes into that list.
Great. Well, any final thoughts then, Scott, on getting the most out of your staff training?
Sure. I mean, at the end of the day, here's the deal. And this is, back to my experience at Dragonfly for my first year, my second year, and beyond. At the end of the day, I had to take a look at my staff and say, okay, that first summer they knew a whole lot of things. They knew a lot of stuff. They just didn't know any of it very well. And what I'd really like everybody to think about is how can maybe my staff knows fewer things, but they know them really well. And that's what I want to get across. And how we develop those things further, whether it's in-service training, whether it's experiential sort of learning, sort of debrief and follow-up by you as their supervisor. All these other ideas when it comes to training, it's what are the few things that we want them to know very well so that they can execute their job, which is creating camp for kids. Like, that's at the end of the day what we're trying to do. So what are those things? You guys have to answer that, but that's sort of the sort of idea that I would like to leave you all with.
Thanks, Scott. That's great. That helps us really get to the meat of staff training. So thank you very much for watching, everybody. My name is Travis Allison from camphacker.org. You can see this video at Camp Hacker and on Scott's site. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks so much, Travis. I appreciate you co-hosting with me. My name is Scott Arizala. You can find out more about what I do at my website, which is thecampcounselor.com. I appreciate everybody tuning in, and we'll see you next summer.
Well, my